Mic check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and I'm looking at the value proposition between retro consoles and modern consoles. And really, the idea or the thought process that's been kind of going through my head is: do retro consoles hold more value than their modern counterparts? And I think that that's a very multi-layered question, because it depends on if you're determining the value of the console based on its technical specs. Are you basing it on the what the console meant for its time, the time that it was released? Are you basing the console on the games that were actually made for it? Are you basing the console on the overall experience it provided you? And then obviously you have somewhat of a nostalgia factor. So the two examples that I have here are, for those of you who don't know, this is a Neo Geo AES system. And obviously, most people that are viewing the channel, you already know that this is a PlayStation 4. And these are two wildly different systems, not only from a technical perspective, but from a time perspective. This was released decades prior to the PlayStation 4 being released. And whereas the PlayStation 4 was more of like a mainline, more mainstream console, the Neo Geo was not quite as mainstream at the time that it was released. During the Neo Geo's day, the leading consoles were really the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, before going into like the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 eras. And they provide two very different experiences, in my opinion. The PlayStation 4 is just an all-around, pretty much standard modern console that allows you to play the majority of modern games that we see. A lot of the games that you can play on the PlayStation 4, you can also play on either PC, on the Xbox One, and even Nintendo Switch in some cases, right? So there aren't a lot of games that, don't get me wrong, the PlayStation 4 has its exclusive titles, but in terms of like the experience, a lot of the games that you would play on the PlayStation 4, you can play on a lot of the other consoles that came out during its time. I think that there's a difference with the Neo Geo, where it's the the Neo Geo brought home the arcade experience to you. It literally took the arcade experience and parked it right in your living room, and you were able to experience video games the same way you would in the arcade. Now, the arcade wouldn't matter to someone today because we're not in an arcade era anymore, but back in the day, back in the 90s, when arcades were still a thing, that was a huge accomplishment, to be able to bring the arcade experience into someone's home. And I would say the only other console to do that on that level, I would say, is probably the Sega Saturn, which was also kind of a non-mainstream console. Yes, the Sega Saturn was released at the same time of the PlayStation, or the original PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64, but the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation were clear leaders for that generation, right? Like, thanks to a lot of the IPs from Nintendo, like Mario 64, Donkey Kong, Smash Bros, all of those classic Nintendo games. That's what really helped the Nintendo 64 break out and, hold its footing in the fifth generation of gaming consoles. But when the Sony PlayStation hit the scene, there were all types of games that put Sony at the forefront of just that generation. So the Sega Saturn, their claim to fame was that, arcade experience as well. And don't get me wrong, the Sega Saturn did an amazing job bringing a lot of those games home. But I don't think anyone did it as well as the Neo Geo. And I think what separates the Neo Geo, the AES, from all of the other consoles from its day, is that there were games that you could only really play on the Neo Geo at that time. When you think about the Metal Slug games, when you think about games like Magician Lord, when you think about some of the shoot 'em ups, Polestar, Blazing Star, a lot of, Shock Troopers, you think of a lot of those classic Neo Geo games, you could only really play those games and get those experiences either in an arcade or when playing the Neo Geo. And so I think that in and of itself kind of gave the Neo Geo its own, type of value. And I would say the same thing even between the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. While yes, there were a lot of games that were released on the Super Nintendo that were also released on the Sega Genesis, each console provided very unique experiences because there were a lot of games that you were only going to get on the Sega Genesis. The Streets of Rage games, the Shinobi games, Alien Storm, Shadow Dancer, Michael Jackson Moonwalker, Gunstar Heroes, the list goes on and on and on. There were so many games that you were only going to play on the Sega Genesis that, Sega felt like a very differentiated console. It felt like the, yang to the Nintendo's yin. And yeah, there were some crossover titles for sure. But again, there were just some Super Nintendo games you were only going to play on Super Nintendo. Zelda, Metroid, Axlay, uh, Chrono Trigger, so many games that were just exclusive to the Super Nintendo. So I think the where a lot of the value comes from when it comes to retro consoles versus modern consoles is retro consoles. You really felt like you had a unique experience with each console, from the NES to the Super NES to the Neo Geo, to the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation, original PlayStation, N64. I want to say once we got to the sixth generation with PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and Dreamcast, that was when you started to see a lot more dilution. A lot of the same games being released across all systems, and you started to see the creativity dwindle. The PlayStation 2 era was probably the last era of like genuine original thought and ideas, and there was just a vast array of games that you could choose from, and you could tell the developers and studios weren't afraid to try new things. But once the seventh generation came around, that's when we started to get into the remake era. We started to get into the spin-off era off of titles that we got, the generation prior, and in some cases 2 and 3 generations prior. And so I think, from a technical standpoint, I mean, obviously it's going to be difficult to compare a console from the 90s to a modern console because it was, there's been so much technical advancement. When it comes to the nostalgia factor, that's not even a fair comparison because one generation is 30 years old, another generation is only a few years back, and not enough time has passed, I think, for there to be a massive buildup of nostalgia for the PlayStation 4. But where I think the retro consoles trump a lot of modern day consoles, with maybe the exception of the Switch, but not even. And the only reason why I give the Switch the slight edge is because of all of the Nintendo games, the Metroid, the Mario games. All of those still provide Nintendo with a great differentiated experience. But I would say it's the experiences from 90s consoles, and just from consoles back in the day, when you think about the Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, Neo Geo, it's the unique experiences that you got from these consoles that I think set them apart from what we're seeing today in today's consoles. But I'm interested to know your thoughts on this. Obviously, I'm just going through the collection as I prepare for an event, but I just wanted to get some thoughts on this from the community. But I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.